The silence in the chamber was a weapon. It was old, heavy, and polished by decades of use. Nancy Pelosi wielded it with the casual mastery of a queen surveying her court. At 84 years old, she no longer merely occupied the speaker's chair. She was fused to it, an icon of institutional dominance whose power was measured not in gavels struck, but in careers broken. Her gaze, a pair of finely sharpened points, settled on a man rising from the Republican side. He was an interruption, a discordant note in a symphony she had conducted for generations. A flicker of annoyance crossed her features, the subtle tightening of muscles around her mouth, a tell that only the most seasoned observers would recognize. "The chair," she announced, her voice a low, resonant hum that carried the chill of impending judgment, "recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Byron Donalds." The words were a formality, but the tone was a dismissal. She let a beat of silence pass, a calculated pause designed to diminish him before he could even speak. Then, leaning into the microphone, she added, her voice now dripping with a cloying, theatrical pity, "And it is with a heavy heart that we must listen to what he has to say." A wave of soft, knowing laughter rippled through the Democratic ranks. It was the sound of courtiers affirming their queen's wit, a chorus of insiders who understood the game. On the monitors overhead, the cameras found Byron Donalds. He was 43, built like a man who understood the value of a strong foundation, his stillness a stark contrast to the performative drama swirling around him. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, floor wax, and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. A political storm front was gathering, and everyone could feel the pressure drop. Pelosi, sensing her moment, prepared to unleash it. She was the storm's architect. "The gentleman from Florida," she began again, her voice shedding its pretense of civility and taking on the hard, cutting edge of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, "is the living embodiment of a tragic bargain." The words landed like stones in the quiet room. "He is a man who has looked at his own reflection, at the history etched into his own skin, and has chosen to betray it for a fleeting proximity to power." Gasps, sharp and theatrical, erupted from the gallery. This wasn't debate. It was an execution. Pelosi was a master of the art, and she was just warming up. He stands there, a sentinel for an ideology that would have seen his grandfathers in chains, and he does so with a smile. He is a vessel, a hollowed-out costume of a man, animated by the very forces that seek to strip away the rights of people who share his heritage. The attack was breathtaking in its cruelty. She was not just questioning his politics. She was attempting to invalidate his very identity. He goes home to a family that must surely live in a state of cognitive dissonance, raising children who will one day read the history of this era and ask their father why he stood on the wrong side of it, why he sold his soul for a pat on the head from his masters. The chamber ignited. From the gallery, a planned chorus of shouts erupted on cue. "Traitor! Traitor! Traitor!" Simultaneously, the massive screens flanking the speaker's rostrum came to life, displaying a curated montage of cable news pundits and talk show hosts. A clip from one network showed a panel questioning his authenticity. Another featured a host, labeling him a prop. It was an orchestra of character assassination, every player hitting their mark, every sound designed to create a crescendo of shame. Byron Donalds stood at the epicenter, a solitary figure in a tempest of manufactured scorn. Hundreds of voices, both in the chamber and on the screens, were screaming the same verdict. He was a fraud, a puppet, a man at war with his own people. A familiar heat began to build in his chest, a disciplined fire he had learned to control long ago. He felt it that day in college, when a professor implied his acceptance was a matter of quota, not merit. He felt it when a store owner shadowed him through the aisles, assuming theft. But, through the cacophony, a voice from his past cut through the noise. It was his father, a retired army sergeant speaking to him after a particularly brutal high school football game. "Byron," he had said, his voice calm and steady, "they want you to get angry. An angry man is predictable. He makes mistakes. You stay calm. You stay smart. You let them exhaust themselves, and then you show them what you're made of. You be the man they never see coming." He thought of his wife, Erica, watching this unfold, her fierce loyalty a shield he carried with him always. He thought of his sons, who would see this footage one day. Pelosi hadn't just attacked a congressman. She had targeted a husband and a father. And in her supreme arrogance, she had made a fatal error. She believed she was facing a politician. She had no idea she was facing a warrior. His mind flashed back to a sweltering summer in Brooklyn, the rhythmic squeak of the fan in his grandmother's apartment. "Grandma, why do they lie like that?" he had asked, a boy grappling with the world's casual cruelty. She had looked up from her Bible, her eyes clear and unwavering. "Because the truth ain't in them, baby, but it's in you. And you remember this. A lie is loud, but the truth is heavy. It's got weight. You just have to have the strength to carry it." Siti. Back in the chamber, Pelosi was reaching the peak of her performance, her voice soaring with righteous fury. "And for this unforgivable betrayal, history will not be kind. It will judge you, Mr. Donalds, and its judgment will be absolute." The room was a vortex of sound. "Madam Speaker." Donalds's voice was not a shout, but it had the density of a physical object. It pierced the chaos with surgical precision. The noise faltered, then died. Every head turned back to him. He rose, not with the hurried motion of a man on the defensive, but with the deliberate, measured calm of a man who held all the cards. He let the silence stretch, making them wait. Then he asked a simple, devastating question. "Was that all?" Pelosi's face, which had been a mask of triumphant fury, now showed a flicker of confusion. His composure was an unscripted variable. The gentleman will proceed," she stammered, a hairline crack appearing in her armor of authority. "Thank you, Madam Speaker," Donalds replied, his tone laced with a dangerous politeness. "I want to thank you for that performance. You have just laid bare for the entire country the heart of your argument, that if a black man does not think the way you demand he think, he is to be excommunicated from his own race. You have made this personal. So now, when I present the evidence that follows, no one can mistake it for mere political theater." He bent down and lifted a thick, bound portfolio onto his desk. "You have questioned my heritage. You have attacked my wife. You have brought my children into this arena. You have attempted to strip me of my very identity." He opened the portfolio with a slow, deliberate motion. "So, let us have a conversation about identity. Let's talk about who truly betrayed the people they claim to represent. Let's talk about your family's business." He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers across the vast chamber. "And let's begin with a simple question of mathematics." The main display screen behind the speaker's chair, which had been a canvas for Pelosi's orchestrated smear, went dark. For a moment, there was only blackness. Then, new text appeared. It was stark, white on black, cold and irrefutable. At the top, a simple heading: Paul Pelosi Sr., Analysis of Key Trades 2022-2024. Below it, two figures stood in brutal contrast. Documented profits from suspicious trades, $54 million. And beneath that, a second line: Equivalent hedge fund benchmark, $14 million. A different sound now filled the chamber. Not the jeers of partisans, but the sharp, collective intake of breath. It was the sound of a narrative shattering. The numbers on the screen were not just data. They were an accusation. $54 million. The figure hung in the air, stark and obscene, a monument to a game played by different rules. The whispers that followed were not of partisan glee, but of genuine shock. On the Republican side, members who had been bracing for a defensive crouch now leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the glow of the screen. a predatory gleam entering their eyes. On the Democratic side, the confident smirks had vanished, replaced by a sea of blank, confused stares. Aides scrambled in the aisles, their faces buried in their phones, frantically trying to find a counter-narrative that did not exist. Nancy Pelosi stood frozen. The triumphant flush that had colored her cheeks moments earlier had evaporated, leaving behind the pale, waxy sheen of a marble statue. The mask of righteous indignation had cracked, and for a split second, a look of pure, animal fear was visible in her eyes before the decades of training took over, slamming the mask back into place. Donald's let the image sear itself into the collective consciousness of the room and the millions watching at home. $54 million, Madam Speaker, he said, his voice a calm, steady anchor in the rising sea of chaos. While American families were watching their savings get wiped out by record inflation, your husband wasn't just surviving. He was performing financial miracles. He wasn't just beating the market. He was achieving returns that legendary investors can only dream of. He paused, letting the weight of the implication settle. The question, Madam Speaker, is not whether your husband is a good investor. The question the American people are asking is whether he is the greatest financial genius in modern history. Or, he leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, if he was simply reading the script, if he had access to information that the rest of the world did not. Pelosi's hand shot out, her fingers wrapping around the microphone stand as if it were the throat of an enemy. My husband, she declared, her voice sharp and brittle, is a private citizen. His financial affairs are his own. I have never, and I repeat, never, had any involvement in the management of his portfolio. The denial was swift, absolute, and rehearsed. Really? Donald's responded, his tone one of polite, almost academic curiosity. He reached into his portfolio and pulled out a single crisp document, holding it up for the cameras to see. Then perhaps you can help the American people understand this remarkable series of coincidences. Because his almost supernatural ability to predict the market seems to align perfectly with your actions as Speaker of this House. The screen behind her flickered again. A new graphic appeared, clean and devastatingly simple. It was a timeline. The heading read, Case Study Number 1, the NVIDIA Trade. The first date on the timeline was marked in plain text, July 15, 2022. On this date, Donald's narrated, your husband, Paul Pelosi, purchased up to $5 million worth of stock options in NVIDIA, a leading semiconductor manufacturer. The next point on the timeline was marked in bright, blood red, July 27, 2022. Just 12 days later, this very chamber, under your direct leadership, Madam Speaker, passed the CHIPS Act, a piece of legislation that you personally championed, which allocated a $52 billion subsidy funded by the American taxpayer directly to the semiconductor industry. Pelosi's vote was highlighted on the screen. Vote Yea. The final point on the timeline showed the result. Profit realized, $1.6 million. Time frame, 73 days. The collective gasp in the room was a physical force. Your husband, Donald stated, his voice now stripped of all emotion, a cold, factual instrument, made a massive bet on a specific industry just days before this House, which you control, voted to inject that exact industry with billions of dollars of public money. He looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering, a prosecutor cornering a hostile witness. After the bill you fought for became law, your husband's investment returned over $1.5 million. That is more than 4 times your official government salary, Madam Speaker, earned in just over 2 months, on a single, perfectly timed trade. He let the silence hang, a suffocating blanket of accusation. So, I will ask you again, Madam Speaker, and I urge you to consider your answer carefully. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. Did you, at any point, discuss the legislative calendar, the content, or the likely outcome of the CHIPS Act vote with your husband before he executed that multi-million-dollar trade? The silence that followed was absolute, a black hole of evasion. Her refusal to answer was louder than any confession. Did you, perhaps over dinner, or a glass of wine at your Napa estate, mention to him that a massive government subsidy for chip makers was imminent? Still, she said nothing. Her jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped in her cheek. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the podium. Did you provide him with any information, any hint, any signal at all, that would have given him an unfair and potentially illegal advantage in the market? Pelosi finally erupted, her voice a shrill cry of indignation. This is an outrageous and slanderous accusation. I have always maintained a firewall between my public duties and my husband's private business. Donalds nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this exact denial. Then it is, without a doubt, the single most astonishing coincidence in the history of the stock market. He reached back into his portfolio, his hand moving with a slow, theatrical deliberation that promised more to come. The portfolio was thick, bristling with color-coded tabs, each one a new chapter in the saga of her family's wealth. But of course, NVIDIA was just one coincidence, wasn't it? A single, solitary miracle. He pulled out another sheaf of papers, fanning them out like a poker player revealing a royal flush. Shall we talk about the miraculous timing of his trades in Microsoft, just before a massive government contract was announced? Or his perfectly timed exit from Visa, just before a secret antitrust lawsuit was filed? Or perhaps his timely investments in Amazon, or Broadcom, or Tesla? He looked up, his eyes locking with hers. Or, Madam Speaker, should we just save time and discuss all of them? Because I assure you, I have the documents for every single one, every suspiciously timed purchase, every impossibly lucrative sale, every multi-million-dollar coincidence that built your family's fortune. Pelosi's hands, which had wielded the gavel with such unshakable authority just minutes before, had begun to tremble. It was a slight tremor, almost imperceptible, but against the dark wood of the rostrum, it was a clear signal of the panic taking root. "We are just getting started, Madam Speaker," Donald said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a chilling promise of the devastation yet to come. "Before this day is over, every American will know exactly how your family got so rich. They will learn about your husband's prophetic trades. They will learn about your son's fraudulent companies. They will see the full, unvarnished picture of an empire built on the abuse of public trust." He sat back down, his movements as calm and deliberate as when he had first stood. "And then," he concluded, "they will finally understand who the real traitor is." The chamber detonated, a chaotic roar of outrage, shock, and demands for order. But this time, the cries of shame were not aimed at Byron Donalds. They were a tidal wave of fury, aimed squarely at the Speaker's chair. Nancy Pelosi had not survived 40 years in the brutal, unforgiving arena of Washington politics by folding at the first sign of trouble. She was a creature of the institution, a master of its arcane rules and hidden levers of power. As the chamber descended into a maelstrom of shock and outrage, she drew upon that deep primal instinct for survival. With a series of sharp, percussive blows of her gavel, she fought to impose her will on the chaos. The sound was not one of order, but of desperation, like a captain trying to patch a hole in a sinking ship. "Order! This chamber will come to order!" Her voice, though strained, was still a formidable instrument, honed by decades of command. The machine, the vast and powerful apparatus of her party, began to stir. "What we are all witnessing here," she declared, her eyes sweeping the room, scanning for loyal faces, "is not a legitimate inquiry. It is a pathetic, partisan smear, a desperate, last-ditch witch hunt from a party with no ideas, no accomplishments, and no vision for the future of this country. Her allies, seasoned veterans of these wars, recognized their cue. They rose to their feet, their applause a rolling thunder of manufactured support, a firewall of noise intended to smother the flames of scandal. The institutional defense was mobilizing. A senior congresswoman from New York, a longtime Pelosi lieutenant, rushed to a microphone. "This is a textbook example of misogyny," she shouted. "When a woman achieves unprecedented power, they cannot attack her on substance, so they attack her husband. They attack her family. It is shameful, and it is predictable." Another ally, a congressman from Illinois, followed immediately. "This is nothing more than a coordinated political hit job, an attempt to distract the American people from the historic progress we have made under Speaker Pelosi's leadership." The Congressional Black Caucus, which had remained conspicuously silent during Pelosi's initial racial attack on Donalds, now found its voice in her defense. A veteran member stood, his face a mask of solemn gravity, pointing a finger not at Pelosi, but at Donalds. "We will not stand by and allow these baseless smears to go unanswered. We stand in solidarity with Speaker Pelosi against this malicious and unfounded character assassination." The younger, more media-savvy members of her caucus were already waging the battle on a different front. On social media, a flurry of synchronized posts appeared, a digital flash mob of support. "Is stand with Nancy. Protect our speaker. A go plies." The chyrons on the cable news networks, monitored on screens throughout the Capitol, began to shift in real time as producers took their cues from the party's messaging. One network's banner, which moments before had read, "Donalds accuses Pelosi of corruption," now read, "GOP launches unverified attack on Pelosi's family." An MSNBC panel was already being assembled, the host gravely intoning, "The stench of a politically motivated attack is all over this. Let's break down the misogynistic undertones of this strategy." The counter-narrative was being deployed with breathtaking speed and efficiency. The full, crushing weight of the Democratic Party's ecosystem, its politicians, its media surrogates, its online activists, was being brought to bear. Its singular goal was to discredit the message by destroying the messenger. Byron Donalds watched the choreographed performance with a sense of detached, almost clinical fascination. This was the swamp's immune system in action, a complex, powerful organism designed to identify any foreign body, any threat to its equilibrium, and neutralize it with overwhelming force. They possessed the power of the narrative. He possessed the power of the facts. He knew his only option was to wait for their storm of rhetoric to pass. He let the applause for her defenders die down. He let the self-righteous pronouncements fade into the thick, tense air. When a fragile silence finally returned, a temporary truce in the war of words, he slowly rose to his feet once more. He did not look angry. He did not look intimidated. He looked like a man who had been patiently waiting for the children to finish their tantrum. "Madam Speaker," he began, his voice once again a beacon of calm in the turbulent room, "I appreciate the passion of your defenders. It was a truly remarkable performance of synchronized outrage." He paused, letting the subtle mockery land. "Now," he continued, his voice becoming crisp and businesslike, "let's talk about Visa." The name dropped into the room like a stone into a still pond, the ripples silencing the remaining murmurs. The screen behind the speaker's chair flickered back to life, wiping away the supportive hashtags and partisan talking points. A new timeline appeared, even more stark and damning than the last. The heading read, "Case Study Number 2, The Visa Trade." The first date was marked July 3, 2024. "On this date," Donalds explained, his voice methodical, "your husband sold his entire position in Visa, amounting to over $500,000 worth of stock." The next entry on the timeline was dated 2 months later, September 24, 2024. "On this date," Donalds continued, "the United States Department of Justice announced a major, market-moving antitrust lawsuit against Visa, alleging monopolistic practices that had been the subject of a highly confidential investigation. The immediate market reaction was noted in red. Result: Visa stock, V, plunges 5% within hours of the announcement, wiping out billions in market value. Donald's let the information sink in, the damning correlation needing no embellishment. "Your husband," he said, his voice a dispassionate instrument of fact, cashed out his position in a financial giant just weeks before the United States Department of Justice, an agency whose oversight falls under the purview of this Congress, filed a lawsuit that sent its stock price into a nosedive. Pelosi leaned forward, her eyes blazing with a renewed fire. "My husband is a brilliant student of the market. He reads the financial press. He makes his own assessments based on publicly available information." Donalds nodded slowly, as if giving her argument serious consideration. "A brilliant student indeed, Madam Speaker, because this particular lawsuit was filed under seal. The investigation leading up to it was one of the most closely guarded secrets in Washington. The army of Wall Street analysts, the men and women who are paid millions of dollars a year to predict exactly these kinds of events, were all caught completely by surprise." He held up a printed headline from the Wall Street Journal, dated the day after the announcement. He read it aloud, his voice clear and steady. "Justice Department's Visa lawsuit blindsides Wall Street, sends shockwaves through payments sector." He placed the paper down gently on his desk. "It blindsided the experts, Madam Speaker. It shocked the entire financial industry. But it didn't shock your husband. He, alone, knew to get out months in advance." He looked directly at her, his voice dropping, becoming more pointed and precise. "You sit on committees with direct oversight of the Department of Justice. You and your leadership team are privy to classified briefings on matters of national economic security." He paused, then asked the question that hung heavy in the air. "Did you, Madam Speaker, receive any information, any briefing, any hint at all about the pending federal investigation into Visa before your husband sold his $500,000 stake?" "That is an absurd and offensive insinuation," she shot back, her voice cracking with strain. "Then explain the pattern," Donalds replied, his voice unyielding, relentless. The screen changed again, this time to a rapid-fire succession of trades, a cascade of damning coincidences. Microsoft, MSFT. Stock purchased days before a $22 billion U.S. Army contract is announced. Profit, $370,000. Apple, AAPL. Stock purchased just before the introduction of favorable App Store legislation you championed. Profit, over $700,000. Amazon, AMZN. Stock purchased weeks before a vote on federal regulations directly affecting the company. Profit, $1.2 million. The final tally appeared at the bottom of the screen, the number from the beginning now imbued with a mountain of damning context. Total documented suspicious trades, $54 million. "This isn't investing, Madam Speaker," Donald said, his voice resonating with quiet, unshakable authority. "This is front-running the market. This is using privileged, non-public information gleaned from a position of immense public power to generate immense private wealth." A crack appeared in the wall of Democratic solidarity. A young progressive congressman from a district in the heart of Texas, a man known for his fiery rhetoric and unwavering party loyalty, slowly stood up. His face was a mask of genuine conflict, the confident swagger gone, replaced by the deep furrows of doubt. "Madam Speaker," he began, his voice hesitant, betraying his inner turmoil, "my constituents, they email my office about these trades. They see the headlines. They want to know how this is possible. How am I supposed to answer them?" The question, earnest and unscripted, hung in the air. It was the first crack in the dam. The crack widened. An older, more moderate Democrat from a swing state in the industrial Midwest, a man whose political survival depended on his connection to blue-collar voters, also rose. "The timing of these trades is deeply concerning," he said, choosing his words with deliberate care. Our constituents deserve transparency. Virtus, then another stood, and another. Perhaps a full and transparent disclosure of all financial records would be in order. We cannot simply dismiss this out of hand. Pelosi began to bang her gavel, but the sound was frantic now, not authoritative. It was the sound of a ruler losing control of her kingdom. The dam of institutional protection, which had seemed so impenetrable just moments before, was beginning to break under the sheer weight of the evidence. Seeing the cracks spreading through her own caucus, sensing the very foundation of her power beginning to tremble, Nancy Pelosi played the card she had held in reserve. It was her most powerful weapon, a tactical nuke she had wielded for decades to silence dissent, short-circuit debate, and end any argument. She rose, no longer looking at Donald's, but turning to face her own wavering members. Her voice, now filled with the gravitas of a seasoned general rallying her troops for a final, desperate charge, boomed through the chamber. "Do you not see what is happening here?" she pleaded, her tone a masterful blend of warning and admonition. "This is the oldest, ugliest play in their book. They find a black face to launch their attack. They send a black Republican to be the vessel for their smear campaign." She let that sink in, planting the seed of a new narrative. They do this for one reason and one reason only, so that when we rightfully defend ourselves, when we call out their lies and their distortions, they can turn around and scream racism at us. It is a cynical, disgusting trap, and they have laid it for all of you. She then turned, her arm outstretched, her finger shaking with theatrical rage as she pointed directly at Byron Donalds. The accusation was venomous, personal, and absolute. This man does not serve his constituents in Florida. He serves the interests of white supremacy. He is a vessel, an empty suit, given a black face to do their bidding, and he does it gladly, for the praise of his masters. The words hung in the air, a poison gas meant to choke off all rational argument, to reframe his evidence-based assault as an act of racial treason. It was a breathtakingly cynical maneuver, a Hail Mary pass designed to change the entire nature of the debate. Byron Donalds stood slowly, the weight of her accusation settling on his shoulders. He did not rush to respond. He let the silence stretch, forcing everyone in the chamber and everyone watching at home to absorb the sheer toxicity of what the Speaker of the House had just said. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, imbued with a profound and weary sadness, yet it carried an undeniable core of steel. "Madam Speaker," he said, shaking his head slowly, as if in genuine disappointment, "you have just proven every single point I have ever made about the modern Democratic Party." He took a few steps away from his desk, moving toward the center of the chamber, occupying the open space between the two warring sides. "You genuinely believe that you own black thought. You believe that black people are not individuals, capable of independent reasoning and forming their own conclusions. You believe we are a monolith, a voting bloc that must adhere to your prescribed ideology." He paused, letting that indictment settle over the room. "And any black person, any single one of us, who dares to disagree with you, who dares to challenge your authority, must therefore be a sellout, a traitor to their race. And Uncle Tom, there is no room in your worldview for a black man who thinks for himself." He let that sink in. "But since you have brought up the subject of selling out black Americans," he continued, his voice gaining strength and purpose, "let's have a serious, data-driven conversation about it." The large screens, which had been dormant during her outburst, flickered back to life. There were no more stock charts, no more timelines of financial trades. Instead, stark and heartbreaking images began to appear, accompanied by brutal, undeniable statistics. The title on the screen read, "San Francisco, California, a 35-year legacy." The data scrolled by, a grim report card of failure. Black resident poverty rate increased by 33%. Median black household income decreased by 8%. Black population experiencing homelessness increased by 200%. The images showed what the numbers meant in human terms. Sprawling homeless encampments under freeway overpasses, boarded-up storefronts in once thriving black neighborhoods, the gaunt, haunted faces of people lost to addiction on the streets of her city. Donalds turned his gaze back to Pelosi, who stared at the screen as if seeing a ghost from a life she had long since left behind. This, Madam Speaker, is your district. This is your legacy. For 35 years, under your uninterrupted leadership, the black community you claim to champion has seen its poverty skyrocket, its income plummet, and its rates of homelessness explode into a full-blown humanitarian crisis that shames a first-world nation. He paused, then delivered the blow with surgical precision. Your personal family net worth is estimated to be over $200 million. Your district's black community is suffering in ways that are almost medieval. He looked her directly in the eye, his voice dropping but losing none of its power. So I ask you, Madam Speaker, who sold out whom? The silence in the chamber was no longer just quiet. It was absolute, a moral vacuum where political posturing and partisan spin could no longer survive. You amassed a family fortune, trading stocks in the very corporations you were supposed to be regulating, while the people of your district lost their businesses and their homes. Donalds continued, his voice a relentless drumbeat of truth. You and your husband purchased sprawling mansions and vineyards, while the number of tents on your city's sidewalks grew like a cancer. You built a financial empire for your family, while the communities you swore an oath to serve crumbled into despair and addiction. His voice hardened, the quiet sadness replaced by a righteous fire. And then, when a black man, who has not forgotten where he comes from, stands up and calls you on it, you have the audacity, the unmitigated gall, to call him a sellout. He shook his head with a look of profound disgust. I do not work for white supremacists, Madam Speaker. I work for the people of the 19th District of Florida, all of them. And unlike you, I do not get rich by doing it. He gestured toward the clerk's office. My financial disclosures are a matter of public record. My net worth has actually decreased since I took my oath of office, because I am here to serve the public, not to serve myself. The contrast was devastating, a perfectly drawn line between a public servant and a ruling oligarch. So don't you ever, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, question my integrity again. Don't you ever question my blackness again. And don't you ever, ever attack my family again. He walked back to his desk, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. Because your husband's corruption is just the beginning of the story. He reached down and opened a new, even thicker folder, its label clearly visible to the C-SPAN cameras. It read, Paul Pelosi, Jr. Associated Enterprises. The names of several companies were listed below it. Info USA, Countrywide, Natural Blue, Ukraine. Pelosi's face, already pale, turned ashen. Shall we continue, Madam Speaker? Byron Donalds let the name on the folder hang in the air, a new front opening in his relentless assault. He waited, allowing the cameras to zoom in, ensuring every viewer at home could read the words. Paul Pelosi, Jr. The speaker sat frozen, a statue of disbelief, as Donalds began to methodically dissect the career of her only son. Let's talk about your son, Paul. A man of many, many talents, it would seem. Donalds began, his voice laced with a cold, surgical irony. A photograph appeared on the main screen. Paul Pelosi, Jr., smiling broadly, looking confident and successful in a tailored suit. Let's start the clock in January of 2007. A proud month for you, Madam Speaker. You made history, becoming the first female Speaker of the House. A truly remarkable achievement. He paused, letting the praise curdle. Just 4 weeks after you took the gavel for the first time, your son, Paul Jr., was hired for a senior position at a company called Info USA. His starting salary, $180,000 a year. Donald's looked up from his notes. A handsome salary for a young man. The only issue was his resume. He had no prior experience in the data marketing industry, no specific educational background to justify the role. A new timeline appeared on the screen, stark and accusatory. January 4th, 2007. Nancy Pelosi is sworn in as Speaker of the House. February 1st, 2007, Paul Pelosi Jr. is hired by Info USA as Senior Vice President. Salary, $180,000 a year. Below, a note was added. Info USA's CEO, Vinod Gupta, was a major political donor and a frequent visitor to your office, Madam Speaker. Yoo-hoo. But the logistics are even more curious, Donalds continued. Info USA was headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska. Your son resided in San Mateo, California, a distance of nearly 2,000 miles. We spoke with former employees at the Omaha headquarters. No one could recall seeing Mr. Pelosi Jr. in the office more than a handful of times over his entire 2-year tenure. He held up a document, and here's the most remarkable part. During this same period, he maintained his other full-time job at Countrywide Financial back in California. He looked around the chamber, posing a question to the room. 2 full-time, executive-level jobs, 2,000 miles apart, simultaneously. How is that possible? The silence was his answer. It's not, he said, his voice firm. Unless one of those jobs isn't a job at all. Unless it's a payment, a retainer for access to one of the most powerful people in the world, his mother. And that other job, Donald said, his voice hardening, the one at Countrywide Financial. He held that position during the absolute peak of the subprime mortgage crisis, at the very company that became the poster child for predatory lending while it was under active federal investigation. New documents flashed on the screen. Loan agreements, internal memos, and what a coincidence. In 2006, just as the crisis was brewing, internal documents show that you, Madam Speaker, personally received multiple VIP loans from Countrywide through their exclusive Friends of Angelo program, reserved for powerful and influential figures. You received sweetheart mortgage rates far below what was available to the public, from a company that was actively lobbying the congressional committees you controlled, even as millions of American families were being tricked into loans designed to make them fail. From the public gallery, a woman stood up, her hand trembling as she held a small, framed photo of a house. Donald saw her and nodded to the sergeant-at-arms. Let her speak. The woman's voice was shaky but clear. My name is Jennifer Martinez. In 2006, a loan officer from Countrywide came to our home. He told my husband and me we were prime borrowers. He lied. Her voice cracked with an ancient, unhealed grief. When the interest rates reset, our monthly payment tripled overnight. We lost our home. My children and I, we were homeless for 8 months. Tears streamed down her face. You got special deals while they ruined us. Your son worked for them. You all knew. You had to have known what they were doing to families like mine. She collapsed back into her seat, her sobs echoing in the now hushed chamber. Other people began to stand, their faces etched with the same story of loss. We lost our house, too. They destroyed our neighborhood. Donalds let their voices hang in the air, a chorus of the ruined. When silence returned, he pressed on, relentless. Then, in 2013, your son co-founds a company called Natural Blue Resources. The mission: green energy, saving the planet. The company's hopeful, eco-friendly logo appeared on the screen. A noble cause, except it was a complete fraud. An official SEC filing replaced the logo. March 2014, U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission charges Natural Blue Resources and its principals with securities fraud. The SEC found that the company was secretly controlled by 2 convicted criminals. They lied to investors, failed to disclose the criminal records of their leadership, and artificially manipulated the stock price in a classic pump-and-dump scheme. He pointed to the document on the screen. And your son's position in this fraudulent enterprise? President and Chief Operating Officer. He personally held over 10 million shares. Donalds then played a video clip. It was Nancy Pelosi at a 2010 environmental conference, beaming with pride. And I'm so proud of my son, Paul, who is here today, and his company, which is doing such vital work in green technology, she said to the audience. Donalds stopped the video. You used your name, your reputation, your office to give this company credibility. People saw that. They trusted your endorsement. An elderly black man stood in the gallery, his body frail but his voice firm. I'm Robert Johnson. I'm a retired postal worker from Baltimore. I saw that video of you. I thought, if the speaker's son is running it, it must be legitimate. His voice broke. I invested $45,000. It was my entire retirement savings. It's all gone. I'm 72 years old, and I stock shelves at Walmart at night because I trusted your family's name. More people stood, their voices a testament to the devastation. I lost $30,000. My kids' college fund, gone. Each face was a portrait of betrayal. But wait, Donald said, his voice cold as ice. There's more. There's Ukraine. The name Ukraine landed in the chamber with the force of a physical blow. The atmosphere, already thick with scandal, grew heavy with the ghosts of recent political history. A map of Eastern Europe appeared on the screen, with Ukraine highlighted in a bright, ominous yellow. In 2017, Byron Donalds began, his voice low and deliberate. Your son, Paul Pelosi Jr., began making numerous trips to Ukraine. He wasn't there as a tourist. He was there for business. Photographs flashed across the screen in a damning sequence. Paul Jr. meeting with Ukrainian businessmen in slick corporate offices. Paul Jr. appearing on a Ukrainian television talk show, discussing energy opportunities. Paul Jr. sitting at a boardroom table with executives from a state-affiliated energy company. All of this was happening, Donalds continued, his voice rising slightly, at the very same time that you, Madam Speaker, were one of the most influential voices in Congress shaping American foreign policy towards Ukraine. You were instrumental in determining the flow of billions of dollars in U.S. aid, military support, and strategic partnerships. He began to walk again, moving into the open space in the center of the floor, turning to face the Democratic side of the aisle directly, addressing them as a group. In 2019, you led the impeachment of a sitting president of the United States. The central charge revolved around a single phone call with the president of Ukraine. He let that sink in, forcing them to relive their own recent history. You told the American people with righteous indignation that it was a grave matter of national security. You said it was about preventing corruption. You insisted over and over that no one should ever use the power of public office to pressure Ukraine for personal or political gain. He let his words hang in the air, a mirror reflecting their own rhetoric back at them. The hypocrisy was so thick it was almost suffocating. And yet, at the same time, your own son was doing business in that very same country, seeking to profit from the same energy sector that was at the heart of the political turmoil, while you, his mother, held the purse strings of American aid to Ukraine. The chamber was silent. The devastating parallel needed no further explanation. Hunter Biden's business dealings in Ukraine, in your view, were grounds for impeachment. Paul Pelosi Jr.'s business dealings in Ukraine, according to you, are nothing to see here. He shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face. This is the hypocrisy that has eroded the American people's trust in our institutions. One set of rules for your political enemies, and a completely different, invisible set of rules for your own family. He walked back to his podium and gestured to the screen. The individual pictures and timelines vanished. replaced by a single complex diagram. It was a sprawling spiderweb of connections, a visual Rosetta Stone for the corruption he had just detailed. At the very center of the web was a portrait of Nancy Pelosi, labeled Speaker of the House, Political Power and Influence. Radiating out from the center were thick, colored lines connecting her to various nodes of the family empire. One line, colored a verdant green for money, led to a box labeled The Husband, Paul Pelosi, Sr. Inside the box, a summary. 54 million in suspiciously timed stock profits. Companies, Nvidia, Visa, Microsoft, etc. Another line, colored a cautionary orange, snaked to a box labeled The Son, Paul Pelosi, Jr. Inside, a list of his enterprises. Info USA, no-show job for access. Countrywide Financial, VIP loans during fraud. Natural Blue Resources, SEC fraud charges, pump and dump. Ukraine, business dealings during policy influence. A third line, colored a deep, angry red, pointed to a box labeled Political Apparatus, with notes on decades of questionable fundraising and the weaponization of institutional power to protect the family. Arrows flowed between the boxes, showing how money from the husband's trades and the son's schemes flowed into family coffers, while the speaker's political power provided the access, credibility, and legislative cover that made it all possible. It was a stunning, damning visual representation of everything Donalds had spent the last hour detailing. This, he announced, his voice resonating with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict, is the Pelosi empire. It is not a story of public service. It is a business model, a 35-year operation that has perfected the art of converting public office into a private, family-run ATM. As he spoke, a quiet but significant event began to unfold. Several senior Democratic members, longtime allies of the Speaker, men and women who had stood by her through countless political wars, began to discreetly gather their papers. They rose from their seats, their faces grim, and began to walk, not with defiance, but with the quiet shame of a defeated army, out of the chamber's side exits. The exodus had begun. But your family's breathtaking corruption is only one part of the story, Donald said, his voice dropping ominously as he watched them leave. He reached for a new folder, this one black and bound with a red ribbon, as if it contained classified material. Now, let's talk about January 6th. Let's talk about your catastrophic failure of leadership and the security of this very Capitol. And let's watch the video evidence that you and your committee fought so hard to keep hidden from the American people. He opened a laptop on his desk. Pelosi's hands gripped the podium, her knuckles bone white. The look on her face was no longer one of anger or disbelief. It was a look of pure, unadulterated fear. Shall we watch it together, Madam Speaker? The screen flickered to life, not with charts or graphs, but with grainy, behind-the-scenes video. The footage was raw, unstaged, and carried the unmistakable tension of a historical crisis unfolding in real time. The title card read, HBO Documentary Footage, January 6, 2021, previously unreleased. The scene was a secure, undisclosed location within the Capitol complex. Nancy Pelosi, visibly stressed, her face etched with fear and frustration, was on the phone with her Chief of Staff, Terry McCullough. The audio was clear, captured by the documentary crew's boom mic. "We have a responsibility, Terry," Pelosi's voice said, urgent and strained. "We did not have the accountability for what was going on, and we should have. This is ridiculous." She paced the room, her agitation palpable. "Why weren't the National Guard here to begin with? They have to be here now." The camera zoomed in on her face as she made a stunning admission. A moment of unguarded honesty in the heart of the chaos. "I take responsibility," she said, her voice dropping, heavy with the weight of the moment, for not having them prepared for more. Byron Donalds hit the spacebar on his laptop, and the image froze on Pelosi's face, at the very moment of her confession. I take responsibility for not having them prepared. Your words, Madam Speaker, Donald said, his voice deceptively soft. On the day of the event, in private, when you believed the cameras of history were not truly rolling, when the political narrative had not yet been written. He then played a second clip. The scene changed to a formal press conference months later. Pelosi stood at a podium, calm, composed, and resolute, the picture of statesmanship. The sole and total responsibility for the events of that day lies with one person, Donald Trump. Donald stopped the video. The chamber was utterly silent, the hypocrisy hanging in the air like thick smoke. So, which is it, Madam Speaker? He asked. Do you take responsibility, as you admitted privately on January 6th, or is it solely the former president's fault, as you claimed publicly once the political opportunity to do so presented itself? A new timeline appeared on the screen, detailing the days leading up to the breach. January 3rd, 5th, 2021, U.S. Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund makes 3 separate formal requests for the deployment of the National Guard based on credible intelligence warnings of potential violence. The response to each request was displayed in bold red letters. Denied. The reason for the denial was cited from internal testimony given to a closed-door committee. Concerns over optics. Speaker Pelosi's office did not want the image of a militarized presence at the Capitol. Donald shook his head slowly, the disgust evident on his face. You rejected the National Guard 3 times, not because the threat wasn't credible, but because you were worried about how it would look on television. A political calculation took precedence over the physical security of this building and every single person in it. He continued, his voice hardening with contempt. And after your catastrophic decision resulted in the breach of the Capitol, what was your next move? You deflected all blame. You created a partisan select committee that spent millions of taxpayer dollars to craft a political narrative. And you buried this footage. He gestured to the frozen image of her on the screen. Because the truth of your failure did not fit that narrative. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. And let's not forget what you did to Chief Sund, the man who tried to protect this Capitol, the man who begged for help. A headline appeared on the screen from a major news outlet. Pelosi calls for immediate resignation of Capitol Police Chief. You made him the scapegoat, Donald said, his voice cold. You forced him out, smeared his name, and destroyed a 30-year career in law enforcement to cover your own tracks. Speaking of taking responsibility, Donald's voice dripped with sarcasm. Let's talk about another crisis. A new piece of video played. It was grainy security footage, dated September 2020. The location was a hair salon in San Francisco. A woman, unmistakably Nancy Pelosi, was seen walking through the salon, her hair wet, a protective cape around her shoulders. A mask was looped around her neck, not covering her face. This was in September of 2020, Donald's narrated, while every single salon in the city of San Francisco had been forced to close for 6 months under lockdown orders that you publicly and vociferously supported. Her own tweets flashed on the screen, a damning contrast to the video. Speaker Pelosi, we must follow the science. Keep businesses closed. Wear your mask. Save lives. He stopped the video. And then you did this. You had the salon opened just for you, so you could get your hair done, indoors, without a mask, breaking the very rules you demanded every other citizen follow, on pain of fines and business closure. From the gallery, a woman with fiery red hair stood up. It was Erica Cayuse. I owned that salon, she said, her voice shaking with a still raw anger. That was my business for 12 years. When this video came out, you didn't apologize. You went on television and said I set you up. You said I owed you an apology. Her voice broke, not with sadness, but with rage. My business was destroyed. I received death threats. I had to move out of the city. I had to close my doors permanently because of what you did. And you never once, not for a single second, said you were sorry. She sat down, wiping tears of fury from her eyes. Rules for thee, but not for me, Donald said quietly. Thousands of small businesses in your district were annihilated by the lockdowns
But you made
championed.
sure
You got your $85 blowout. He gestured to the main screen, where a massive, comprehensive timeline now appeared, summarizing the entire case against her. It was titled, The Pelosi Record, a 35-year audit. The points scrolled by like a funeral dirge. Husband, $54 million in suspicious stock trades. Son, multiple fraud schemes, SEC charges, victim losses, campaign finance, 20-plus years of FEC violations and fines. Abuse of power, January 6th, security failures and cover-up. Hypocrisy, COVID lockdown violations and small business destruction. Net worth, $240 million on a public servant's salary. District decay, homelessness, plus 200%, poverty, plus 33%. 35 years, Donald said, his voice resonating through the chamber. This is your record. The silence was broken by a new voice, one that carried immense weight. A senior Democrat from Massachusetts, a man with nearly 30 years in Congress, rose slowly to his feet. He was a pillar of the establishment, a longtime Pelosi ally, a man who had stood with her in 100 battles. Madam Speaker, he said, his voice heavy with a profound reluctance, these are serious and deeply disturbing allegations. They require a full, immediate, and transparent investigation by the House Ethics Committee. Pelosi stared at him, her face a mask of pure betrayal. Then another senior Democrat stood. I agree. The American people deserve answers. Then another. We cannot simply ignore this mountain of evidence. Even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, from the progressive wing, stood and stated carefully, we have always advocated for transparency and accountability. That standard must apply to everyone, regardless of party. Pelosi looked around the chamber, at the empty seats of those who had fled, at the averted eyes of those who remained, at the staffers already slipping out of the side doors. 35 years of power, loyalty, and fear were evaporating before her very eyes. Byron Donalds returned to his desk, but only for a moment. He retrieved one final folder, this one thin and unassuming. We have discussed your husband's prophetic trading, he began, his voice taking on a somber, deliberate tone. We have discussed your son's fraudulent schemes. We have discussed your abuse of power and your breathtaking hypocrisy. He opened the final folder. Now, let's talk about what all of this corruption purchased. Let's show the American people exactly what you bought with 35 years of betrayal. Let's talk about your real net worth, and let's contrast it with the fate of the people you swore an oath to serve. Nancy Pelosi sat motionless, frozen in the speaker's chair. The fight had gone out of her. The defiance had drained away, leaving an empty vessel. The kill shot was coming, and she knew it. The main screen changed to a simple, brutal graph. It charted a line that shot almost vertically upward, a trajectory that defied logic and gravity. The title read, Nancy Pelosi, Net Worth Growth. The data points were stark. 1987, enters Congress, net worth $2 million. 2025, present day, net worth $240 million. Below the graph, a simple calculation was displayed, the kind of math a fourth grader could do. Increase in wealth, $238 million. Total congressional salary, 35 years, $7 million. The final number was highlighted in a blood red, a gaping hole in her financial history. Unexplained wealth, $231 million. The math is not complicated, Madam Speaker, Donald said, his voice quiet, but carrying an immense, crushing weight. You are short by over $230 million. Where did it come from? The screen then began to display photographs of her assets, a slideshow of opulence that was grotesque in the context of the preceding testimony. A sprawling, terracotta-roofed mansion in Pacific Heights, San Francisco, valued at over $25 million. A lavish, multi-acre vineyard estate in the heart of Napa Valley, also valued at over $25 million. A portfolio of other luxury properties, condos, and commercial buildings. Your annual property tax bill alone, Donalds noted, is more than most American families earn in a year. Then the screen split into two. On the left, a sun-drenched image of Pelosi's Napa mansion, with its pristine gardens, private security, and rolling vine-covered hills. On the right, a grim, gray photograph taken that same week in the Tenderloin district, in the heart of her congressional district. It showed a block lined with dirty, collapsing tents, piles of garbage, and the discarded needles of drug users. The statistics returned, driving the point home with brutal force. San Francisco under Pelosi. Homelessness crisis. Plow 200%. Open-air drug use and deaths. Palos 211%. Violent crime. Soaring. Population. Exodus. 72,000 residents have fled the city in the last 3 years. From the gallery, a young black woman stood, her body trembling, not with fear, but with a righteous, holy anger. "My name is Keisha Williams," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the gloom. "I was born and raised in San Francisco. My family has lived there for 3 generations. I'm a registered nurse, and I make $65,000 a year. I cannot afford to live in the city I have always called home. I commute 2 hours each way from a rented room." She pointed a shaking finger at the image of Pelosi's mansion on the screen. "My grandmother's house, the one I grew up in, we had to sell it last year. We couldn't afford the property taxes anymore." Tears of frustration streamed down her face. "Where were you when families like mine were being pushed out? Where was your fight for us while you were getting rich?" An elderly Asian man stood up, his shoulders slumped with a weary defeat. "I owned a small grocery store on Larkin Street for 40 years, he said, his voice raspy with age and sorrow. "My store was robbed 11 times in the last year alone. When I called the police, they told me there was nothing they could do. I closed my doors for good last month. 40 years of my life, gone." He looked at Pelosi, his eyes filled not with hatred, but with a profound, soul-deep sadness. "You live behind gates in Pacific Heights with private security guards. My store is boarded up with plywood, and you did nothing for us." More constituents began to stand, their stories a torrent of pain and neglect. Donalds let each voice be heard, each story a new crack in the foundation of Pelosi's legacy. "While your district collapsed into a failed state," he summarized, his voice a cold fury, "you became $240 million richer." He pulled out one last document. "Your name has become so synonymous with this behavior that legislation was literally named after your corruption. The Pelosi Act, a bill to prevent elected leaders from owning securities and investments. Senator Josh Hawley named it after you, Madam Speaker, because you are the undisputed national symbol of congressional corruption." He then played a short clip of the popular comedian Jon Stewart. "How is it that Congress can get away with this?" Stewart asked incredulously on the screen. "Martha Stewart went to jail for one trade. Nancy Pelosi's husband is beating every hedge fund on Wall Street. It's insane." Even the few Democrats who remained in the chamber couldn't help but nod in grim agreement. Donalds began to walk toward the speaker's rostrum. Pelosi seemed to shrink in her chair as he approached. "You want to know why this is personal for me, Madam Speaker?" His voice softened, but the words cut deeper than any shout. Real, raw emotion entered his voice for the first time. "You called me a token. You attacked my wife and my children. You tried to erase my identity because I dared to challenge your authority." His eyes flashed with a fierce, burning pride. "I grew up in the projects in Brooklyn, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse just to keep the lights on. There were nights we had to choose between paying the rent and buying groceries. He gestured to himself. I worked my way through college. I paid my own way. I had no family dynasty to open doors for me, no trust fund to fall back on, no shortcuts. He pulled his own financial disclosure from his pocket and held it up. When I was elected to Congress, my net worth was $1.2 million. Today, it is $850,000. It has gone down, Madam Speaker, because I am actually here to serve. The contrast with her $240 million fortune was a silent, screaming indictment. I am here to fight for people like my mother, for people like Keisha Williams, and the man who lost his store, people who work hard and deserve honest, decent leadership. His voice began to rise, filled with the power of his conviction. You entered this institution with $2 million, and you are leaving with $240 million. You got rich while your constituents got poor. You bought mansions while they became homeless. He was standing directly in front of her now, pointing not at her, but at the Speaker's seal on the rostrum. So, don't you ever question my integrity. Don't you ever question who I serve. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed through the silent chamber. A final, fatal blow. Because, compared to you, Madam Speaker, I am a saint. The chamber was silent for a single suspended heartbeat, and then it shattered. The Republican side erupted in a unified, primal roar. It was a tidal wave of voices shouting, "Vote! Vote! Ethics investigation! Vote, now!" Democrats, leaderless and morally shattered, did not even attempt a defense. They fled. It was a panicked, disorganized rout, a mad scramble for the exits as they ran from the television cameras, from the questions, and most of all, from the toxic political radiation emanating from the Speaker's chair. The press gallery, suspended above the floor, exploded into a frenzy of its own. Reporters yelled into their phones, their voices sharp with the thrill of a career-defining story. "It's over! She's done!" Producers' voices squawked through earpieces. Cameras swiveled, chasing the fleeing congressman, then snapping back to the devastated, motionless figure of the Speaker. C-SPAN, the usually staid and sober network, saw its viewership numbers rocket past 50 million, a record-breaking surge that caused its servers to buckle under the unprecedented traffic. On social media, the story had gone nuclear. The hashtag Pelosi Exposed was the #1 trend worldwide, followed closely by Go Byron Donalds. Over 100 million tweets mentioning the confrontation flooded the platform in the first hour. On TikTok, short, brutal clips of the takedown were accumulating views at a staggering rate. Byron Donalds destroys Nancy Pelosi hit 50 million views. Watch Pelosi's face when the evidence drops climbed to 35 million. Nancy Pelosi attempted to stand. She gripped the podium, the same podium from which she had ruled for years with an iron will, but her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She pushed herself up, but her legs, the legs that had carried her through decades of power, buckled beneath her. At 84 years old, 4 hours of relentless, systematic psychological destruction had taken a devastating physical toll. "I need," she began, her voice a dry, rasping whisper that was lost in the cacophony. "Help me up." A pair of junior staffers, barely out of college, their faces pale with shock, rushed to her side. They tried to help her to her feet, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The strength, the will, it was all gone. "Get me a wheelchair," she finally conceded, the words a surrender, a final, humiliating admission of defeat. The symbolism was crushing, a visual metaphor so perfect it seemed scripted. Nancy Pelosi, the woman who had wielded absolute authority with an iron fist, was now unable to leave her own chamber without assistance, an invalid being removed from the scene of her political death. The photographers' cameras flashed relentlessly, a strobe-lit nightmare, capturing the image that would forever define her downfall. The hallway outside the chamber was a war zone of shouting reporters and jostling camera crews. "Madam Speaker, Will you resign? What is your response to the insider trading allegations? Will you cooperate with the DOJ investigation? They swarmed around her, a pack of sharks tasting blood in the water. The wheelchair was being pushed by a temporary staffer, not her usual security detail, who had mysteriously vanished. He was young, nervous, and took a wrong turn twice in the labyrinthine corridors of the Capitol, extending the humiliating parade of her defeat. The elevator ride was silent, shared only with a single terrified junior aide. As the doors closed, sealing them in a small, quiet box, Pelosi finally spoke, her voice hollow, stripped of all its former power. How? How did this happen? The young woman, barely 22, looked at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. Ma'am, she stammered, with all due respect, people have been whispering about this stuff for years. The stock trades, family, we couldn't say it out loud. Everyone knew something wasn't right. Everyone knew the numbers didn't add up. Pelosi said nothing. What was there to say? The truth had been an open secret, a ghost haunting the halls of her power, and Byron Donalds had simply been the first person with the courage to turn on the lights. When she finally reached her office, the process of her erasure was already underway. A maintenance worker was carefully unscrewing the brass nameplate from the wall outside her grand office suite. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. The plate came off, leaving behind two small, dark holes in the wall that looked like weeping wounds. Inside, the atmosphere was one of quiet panic. Staffers were not packing her belongings. They were packing their own, clearing out their desks, updating their resumes, getting off the sinking ship before it was fully submerged. Her phone buzzed incessantly on her desk. 47 missed calls. 93 unread text messages. She scrolled through the names, a list of her most powerful and loyal allies, people she had elevated, protected, and funded for decades. She tried calling them back, one by one. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. A single text message came in from a senior senator she had mentored for over a decade. It read, Nancy, I'm sorry. I can't be seen to be involved in this. My re-election is too close. It's just politics. She tried her husband, Paul. Voicemail. She tried her son, Paul Jr. Voicemail. Her daughters. Voicemail. Every member of the empire was now protecting themselves. Finally, a call came through. It was Paul Sr. His voice was not warm or concerned. It was cold, distant, and clinical. The voice of a man talking to his lawyer. Nancy, he said. The word clipped. The lawyers have been clear. We need to separate our finances immediately. File separate tax returns. They're even advising separate residences for the time being. He paused, a beat of cold, empty air. Until this blows over, I have to protect my own assets. The DOJ, they might come after me. You understand, don't you? The line went dead. Click. 58 years of marriage, of partnership in building the empire, dissolved in a brief, brutal legal strategy. Pelosi sat alone in her vast, silent office as dusk fell over Washington. She didn't turn on the lights. She just sat in the gathering gloom, a queen on a dismantled throne, listening to the sound of her own irrelevance. At 84 years old, she had lost everything in a single afternoon. Power, legacy, allies, everything, family. 3 weeks later, the press conference was a stark and pathetic affair. There was no grand hall, no sea of cheering supporters, just a simple wooden podium set up in a small, sterile conference room at a downtown hotel. A handful of reporters, the dregs of the Washington press corps who drew the short straw, were in attendance. Nancy Pelosi, looking frail and far older than her 84 years, approached the microphone. Her movements were slow, her face a gray mask of defeat. She unfolded a single sheet of paper, her hands trembling slightly. After 35 years of public service, she began, her voice flat, devoid of its once famous fire, a monotone reading of her own political obituary. I am announcing my resignation from the United States Congress effective immediately. She looked up from the paper, her eyes empty, scanning the room without seeing anyone. I am proud of my legislative record. I am grateful for the opportunity I was given to serve the American people. Thank you. She folded the paper, turned, and walked away from the podium without taking a single question. It was the shortest, most anticlimactic, most humiliating exit of a major political figure in modern history. The empire was officially liquidated. Within hours, the House Ethics Committee announced a comprehensive bipartisan investigation. The Department of Justice formally confirmed it was reviewing all of Paul Pelosi Sr.'s stock trades from the past 15 years. The FBI opened a new inquiry into the business dealings of Paul Jr. The SEC reopened its fraud case against Natural Blue Resources, and the IRS began a forensic audit of her family's finances going back decades. The great mansions and the Napa vineyard went up for sale, their value now tainted by scandal, liquidated to pay for a phalanx of lawyers. Paul Sr. formally filed for legal separation, his public statement citing irreconcilable differences. Paul Jr., facing renewed federal scrutiny, fled the country for Singapore, a fugitive from the legacy his family had built. The dynasty had not just fallen, it had scattered to the winds. 6 months later, Nancy Pelosi sat alone in a modest rented apartment in Sausalito, overlooking the bay. 2 bedrooms, generic furniture, a world away from the baronial splendor she had once known. The legal bills were consuming her fortune at an astonishing rate. She poured a glass of wine from a $12 bottle, a bitter vintage of her new reality. At 85, she was too old to rebuild a life, too infamous to hide from her past, and too proud to ever admit her own guilt. On her coffee table sat a newly published political science textbook, a gift from a former aide who no longer returned her calls. A chapter was bookmarked. Chapter 12. The Architecture of Institutional Corruption. Her downfall was now a case study. 4 pages of timelines, evidence, and analysis, a permanent warning to future generations. Her legacy was not that of a trailblazer, but of a cautionary tale. The phone hadn't rung in days. The invitations had long since stopped. At night, in the quiet darkness, she would see Byron Donalds's face, calm, prepared, and certain, holding his folders of evidence. She had poked a bear she thought was a cub. She had assumed her power was absolute, that the institution would protect her. But he had come armed with simple, undeniable facts, and facts had proven more powerful than fear. He had been right about everything, and that was the cruelest truth of all. That same evening, 600 miles away, Byron Donalds sat not in a Washington, D.C. steakhouse, but in the noisy, vibrant gymnasium of the Liberty City Community Center in Miami. The death threats that followed his speech had been real, forcing his family to take temporary security precautions. But the wave of support had been a tidal wave. His office was flooded with speaking invitations. Fundraising for his next campaign had exploded. But most importantly, calls from his constituents were running 95% positive. He was here tonight, not in his own district, but simply to serve, helping a local nonprofit organize a youth entrepreneurship program. He was teaching a group of teenagers the basics of financial literacy, of business ethics. A young man named Marcus, about 17, approached him afterward. "Congressman," he said, "I watched your whole speech on YouTube. Man, I really thought you were going to lose when she called you all those names." "But I didn't run, did I?" Donalds replied with a smile. "No, sir," Marcus said, shaking his head in admiration. "You just kept hitting them with the facts. That was powerful." The teenager paused, thinking. "My dad always says the Democrats own the black vote. But watching you, I don't think anybody owns my vote." Donalds put a firm hand on the young man's shoulder. "Your dad is a smart man, but on this, he's mistaken. Nobody owns your vote, Marcus. Because you're an American, you have the right and the responsibility to think for yourself, question everything, and hold every single politician accountable for their actions. He looked him in the eye. Even me. Especially you, Marcus asked with a grin. Especially me, Donalds confirmed. If I ever do what she did, you call me out. Deal? The kid's grin widened. Deal. Driving home later, Donalds reflected that this was the real victory. Not the destruction of Nancy Pelosi, but the empowerment of a generation to think for themselves. A text from his wife Erica lit up his phone. Kids are asking when you'll be home. It's movie night. He smiled. He was on his way home, not to a mansion built on corruption, but to a life built on integrity. He had chosen truth over power, and he could look his children in the eye and himself in the mirror. That was everything. The story of Nancy Pelosi's corruption festered for 35 years. His exposure of it took 4 hours. 4 hours to dismantle a dynasty built on lies, because one man armed with courage and the truth was more powerful than all the machinery of a corrupt institution. That is the lesson. That is the legacy. That was the reckoning. If you believe that truth and accountability are worth fighting for, then smash that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more stories they don't want you to hear. And never ever stop demanding the truth.